Negotiating the end of an 11-year war, Afghan and U.S. presidents agree to speed up the withdrawal of U.S. combat troops from Afghanistan. But is the country ready to protect itself? And Major League Baseball and its players agree to expand testing for performance-enhancing drugs. What took them so long to crack down? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Kimberly Halkett. Afghan President Hamid Karzai is in town for talks with U.S. officials about the future of American troops in the country. After long and deadly war, President Obama announced plans to move U.S. combat troops into an advisory role slightly ahead of schedule. But exactly when and just how many will remain is still unclear. And then there's neighboring Pakistan, where increasing violence and instability is a threat to Afghanistan's future. As Patty Culhane reports, many questions remain.
The presidents of Afghanistan and the United States came out, talked to the media, didn't say very much. We do know that there's some very big issues that remain to be solved between the two. From the Afghan perspective, they wanted full control of their prisons. President Barack Obama says that will in fact happen. It's been promised before. He says it will happen now. Now, President Karzai also wants some military hardware. The Pentagon made it seem as if they were making progress on that issue, but didn't give any specifics. From President Barack Obama's standpoint, he came into this meeting wanting some assurances. He wants immunity for any U.S. troops that stay in Afghanistan after 2014, and he used his leverage, often saying in this press conference, if there is a mission to be had after 2014, putting out there to the Afghans that he could, in fact, pull American troops a lot earlier than they want to see happen. As for how the troops are going to look through 2013, at the end of 2014, the White House said he wouldn't announce that now. In fact, he didn't. He could in the next couple of months.
Well, to discuss what the future relationship between the two countries will be, we are joined by Jack Keane, a retired four-star general and former vice chief of staff with the U.S. military, and SHUJA NAWAZ, the director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. General, I want to start with you. So the leaders have agreed to speed up slightly the schedule of U.S. troops in terms of the supporting role. What do you think the reason was for the acceleration of this timetable?
Well, I think that was pretty much a given. That was decided on really last year, that we would transition in 2013 from a combat role to a training assistance role, and I think we formalized that decision today. Certainly all the preparations in the theater in Afghanistan has been toward that end. We've been pulling away from combat roles for some time now. And
was it a political statement to speed this up slightly?
Well, I think I believe the commander would prefer to have stayed in the combat role all the way through 2013. This is what General Allen preferred to do. I can't speak to what the motivation of the decision makers were in the White House in changing that recommendation, but General Allen knew last year that this was going to take place, and they made all the plans to do it. Mr.
Nawaz, President Karzai has said he's been pleased by the fact this means that there will be no foreign troops in Afghan villages by the spring. Is that a good thing, though? In terms of security, is that something that Afghanistan is going to be able to deal with?
Well, as the often used pair of words, challenge and opportunity, come to mind, I think it is going to be a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for the Afghan army and the Afghan National Security Forces in general to show that they have now acquired enough skills and training to be able to operate reasonably autonomously. And the fact that the United States will be playing an advisory role in 2013 and into 2014 provides them that additional backup that's very necessary at this point.
And we certainly heard both leaders saying that their impression was that these forces are in fact exceeding expectations. But then when you talk to some of the soldiers who have actually been there and been on the ground, you often get a very different picture.
Well, they have to operate autonomously for us to make a firm judgment about it. Till now, very few of their operations have been as autonomous as they're going to be in this year and going into 2014. The important thing really is the officer class now ready and trained and able to take over the leadership, which previously had been provided a lot by the coalition forces.
General, are the forces ready to take on this role, or is this sort of political leaders sort of saying what they would like to happen and hoping it really comes true?
We've spent a lot of time on this, and I have personally, and I believe we're ready to make a transition where they can conduct operations in the lead. But here's something the viewing audience has to understand, and even some of our government officials truly don't understand this, is there was never an intent for the Afghans to operate as a military and as a police force without some support from NATO forces. And they don't have intelligence, they don't have air support, and they lack some logistics. We sharpened the spear by building infantry forces, and because we needed a lot of them. So we accepted risk with not having all of the so-called enablers to support them. And to be quite frank about it,
who are you talking about when you say enablers?
And their intelligence, their anti-IED capabilities, artillery, air support, and logistics. Our European allies who work with us, we provide many of those functions for them every single day. So there was never an intent that the Afghans would be totally on their own without some of the support that they need. So I'm hoping that the final decision on what the president decides to leave in Afghanistan, he leaves some of those forces, NATO forces, to truly help this be a comprehensive organization. They'll do the fighting, but we would do some of the supporting.
There certainly is a difference of opinion, though, when it comes to the size of that force. You know, we've heard everything from commanders on the ground saying that there's a need for as much as 30,000 U.S. troops to remain. But the White House has also said that zero troops is an option. I mean, where do you fall on that, General?
Well, if you gave the Afghans no support whatsoever, you are telling them that they're totally on their own. The morale of that and the psychological impact of that would be catastrophic. What it would do to the enemy to embolden them would be much the same in the opposite direction. And from a practical matter, it would lead to failure.
Mr. Nawaz, you know, we can't really talk about the security of Pakistan without talking about the shared border, or sorry, with Afghanistan without talking about the shared border with Pakistan. I mean, even this is a concern for Afghans. They say they're worried about that southern border. How is this going to be addressed?
Well, Pakistan has to make up its mind. I think there's some indications that they're prepared now to see less of a role for themselves in Afghanistan, but they really have to show it with actions to be able to pull back from trying to control or leverage whatever assets, quote unquote, they have within the country. Because if Afghanistan deteriorates into chaos and civil war, it'll be very bad for Afghanistan. It'll be a sheer disaster for Pakistan, because it creates reverse sanctuary. All the Pakistani Taliban and the Punjabi Taliban are going to be finding sanctuary on the other side of the border, and Pakistan is facing a huge internal militancy that will be exacerbated if Afghanistan goes south.
Well, let's listen to what the president had to say when he was talking about this very issue. Now, both sides did speak about the issue of Pakistan and how stability in that country is key to Afghanistan's future. Here's what President Obama had to say.
With respect to Pakistan's and safe havens there, Afghanistan and the United States and Pakistan all have an interest in reducing the threat of extremism in some of these border regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that's going to require more than simply military actions. That's really going to require political and diplomatic work between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the United States obviously will have an interest in facilitating and participating in cooperation between the two sovereign countries.
So, Mr. Nawaz, I think this is the point you're making, is that it's not just a military approach to address this, but it's going to take political will as well.
And that's been missing in large part in Pakistan, because the country is now in the throes of pre-election fever. There has to be an election this spring. The tough economic decisions that need to be made are not being made. And by this summer, Pakistan will face its own fiscal cliff. And it will really create a serious downward spiral for the country unless they can stabilize their border with Afghanistan, allow Afghanistan to be a stable, prosperous entity to the west, open up relations with India on the east so that they're not fighting for space in Afghanistan, and look inwards and deal with the internal militancy. There are some good signs. The military has now come up with a doctrine that actually recognizes that the enemy is not India but internal. The question now is how quickly can the military and the civil get on the same page and bring counterinsurgency and counterterrorism together.
General, from a U.S. standpoint, though, what does the U.S. need to do to ensure that all of this occurs?
Well, frankly, we've had good cooperation with Pakistan's military on a number of issues. They've just made a decision to move to low-intensity conflict as central to how they're going to conduct future operations as opposed to conventional operations with India. And we have been urging them to do that for some time, and I think we've had some influence. It was their decision, to be sure. But I think the touch point for the U.S. military and the Pakistan military has been the safe havens in Pakistan that the Taliban are operating out of. And quite frankly, we know from very good evidence that they do receive support from Pakistan military, particularly the ISI, at those locations in terms of intelligence and resources. And certainly as we move forward, and Pakistan is making a political choice in terms of the stability of Afghanistan and the Taliban's role in that and their relationship to the government of Afghanistan, we would hope that including in that choice, in that political choice, would be pulling away from the support for those safe havens that the Afghans operate out of in Pakistan.
When you listen to President Karzai, though, and President Obama, though, it did seem like as the two nations discussed this drawdown and implementing that to the end of 2014, that there still, though, is an awful lot of uncertainty about how this is going to play out.
Oh, absolutely. It is not predetermined that when we reduce our forces to whatever size our decision makers determine is best, it is not predetermined. It is the future success of Afghanistan. We're going to go through a political transition here. As we all know, in 2014, there's also going to be an economic transition as we pull much of the resources out of that country. There'll probably be some kind of recession as a result of it.
And is there the fear that we could see sort of a repeat of what happened in Iraq when the forces finally left? You know, it became, you know, unstable. There was political stalemate. Is there the fear that that could happen again?
It's possible that we could have that kind of situation. I think the analogous one is closer to what the Soviet Union did in 1989. They continued to support Afghanistan, you know, the communist regime government that was running it, with resources despite the fact that they had pulled their troops out. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of that came away, and that permitted the Taliban to come back on the scene and eventually take control of the country. That's what we would not want to have happen here. We need to continue the political support. We need to continue the military support as well.
Mr. Nawaz, a final word from you. What do you feel is sort of the prescription that is needed moving forward, and is there the political will, do you think, to make that happen?
I think, as General Keane said earlier on, signaling is very critical. The last thing you want to tell the Afghans is, we're out of here. Because then they're going to do what Maliki did in Iraq and end everything. And so it's all or nothing. I think it's very important for the United States to remain engaged and also to continue the economic assistance and to bring the European allies on board for that. Because Afghanistan has already made tremendous progress on many fronts, at the social level, at the economic level. And it's going to be very difficult for any successor regime to roll those things back. That progress needs to be sustained and maintained, and if the U.S. has to have credibility in the region, it must stay the course in terms of its engagement and support for Afghanistan.
Gentlemen, thank you. Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Hello, I'm outside of Washington Nationals baseball stadium in a week when the sport has been trying to clean up its act. On Thursday, Major League Baseball and the Players Union agreed to an expanded drug testing program. For the first time, blood testing for human growth hormone, or HGH, will be conducted during the long baseball season. Previously, it was just done in the preseason. Testing for testosterone will also be enhanced. Now, the sport has endured years of controversy with performance-enhancing drugs. The move comes just a day after baseball writers failed to endorse any former players to the prestigious Baseball Hall of Fame because of past association with steroid use. Among those denied entry, Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds, arguably the greatest pitcher and hitter of their generation. So now baseball has one of the strictest drug testing programs of all the professional sports leagues in North America. So will others, like football, soon follow suit. Well, joining me to discuss drugs, baseball, and other U.S. sports are Dave Zirin, sports writer for The Nation magazine, and from Portland, Oregon, Rob Neyer, the national baseball editor for SB Nation. So why don't I start with you, Dave? Why has it taken so long for baseball to get tougher on performance-enhancing drugs?
Well, for a very long time, there was an active culture of collusion between ownership, between trainers, between management, and of course players themselves. It was well known starting back in the 1980s that steroids were a part of the game, and then in 1994 there was a baseball strike that turned into a lockout that canceled the World Series for the first time, and then really baseball rode the home run to unparalleled economic success. And one of the things that's so disturbing about some of the recent high-handedness about the issue of performance-enhancing drugs, the recent Hall of Fame vote that kept Bonds and Clemens out, is that the same writers who voted to keep these players out of the Hall of Fame were the same writers who really turned a blind eye in the 1990s when the turnstiles were moving, when the power of the game was unparalleled, and when people like Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa really captured the attention of the nation back in 1998. So what I would like to see personally is a little more accountability and a little more consistency and much more a lead from the commissioner's office, not just about how we see the game's present with more testing, but how we judge the game's past.
Rob, do you agree with that, that it's somewhat hypocritical of many of these baseball writers to not endorse any former players to the Baseball Hall of Fame?
Well, I think there's certainly some hypocrisy involved here. No question that a lot of the writers simply missed the story back in the 90s and into this century. But really, I think there wasn't a concerted effort. Collusion is a strong word. I suppose it applies here. Really, everyone just took the path of least resistance. It would have been very difficult for baseball to do anything, to fight with the union over this issue. Should they have done it? Sure. Should some of the players have stood up for their own members, their own fellow union members, and said, you know what, this isn't good for the game, it isn't good for the union. Ultimately, it's going to be a big issue. Yes, they should have. But everybody did what was the easiest thing to do, which is just sort of let it ride, which, by the way, is what every other sport has continued to do to this day.
Mm-hmm. But isn't it, I mean, it seems a little high and mighty to even to take that standpoint in many ways, because these athletes were not hired for their ethics or for their adherence to sort of ethics code. They were hired for their athleticism. And many would argue that's really human behavior, to use every advantage you can to try and achieve the best result. They're there to make money, aren't they?
Well, yeah, but there's also, with baseball in particular, and sports in general, but I would argue particularly in baseball, there's also a moral expectation that I think we as fans project onto players, to have them live up to an archetype of a previous generation of player that frankly didn't exist. I mean, performance enhancers have always been a part of Major League Baseball. This is well documented. You could go back to Pud Galvin in the 19th century, who was praised by the Washington Post for drinking an elixir made of monkey testosterone because he felt it made him a better pitcher. And throughout baseball's history, there has been this unwritten rule that says you do what you have to do to win, whether that's scuff the ball, whether that's take amphetamines so you can stay more focused and work out harder. That's always been a part of the game. Yet steroids in the 1990s is being looked at very differently. I think for the basic reason that the 90s saw this explosion of home runs, and there were other factors that led to the power in the 90s, like smaller stadiums and a smaller strike zone. But what it led to was an evisceration of the record books. And what really separates baseball from other sports is this question of numbers and holding numbers sacred. Like, I can tell you right now, the #2 home run hitter all time in Major League Baseball, Hank Aaron, 755. I know that number like I know my own birthday. But I also know that Barry Sanders is the second leading rusher in NFL history. I could not tell you how many yards Barry Sanders rushed for. But you're right about the hypocrisy. Like, there were people just nominated for Oscars who I'm sure have had augmentation surgery of all kind performance enhancers, but there is a different metric by which we look at athletes. Is
it sort of wrong to hold players, though, to this moral expectation when they really are part of an industry, though, that rewarded athleticism, sometimes even when it appeared on face value to be almost superhuman?
Well, I don't believe that we should demonize the players who use drugs in the 1990s and in the 2000s. Any more than we demonize the players who, you know, Dave mentioned, amphetamines were rampant in baseball throughout the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and beyond. Amphetamines were just made illegal in baseball about 7 years ago. Before that, they were widespread, and those players have not been demonized at all. They are the players that we lionize, actually. Most of those players were using amphetamines, and nobody cares about it at all. So Dave's exactly right. The difference is the statistics. It's the home runs. We hold baseball to a higher standard, especially the statistics of baseball, and I'm not sure that's a bad thing, but it certainly isn't fair to the baseball players who were there.
So Dave, now there's this effort to try and correct the past, to move forward. How is this going to affect the game, and is it going to be enough to truly cut drugs from the game?
Well, that's what's so vexing about this, because you could never before talk about serious drug testing unless you were talking about in-season blood testing, because HGH is only able to be identified through a blood test, and the way in which the modern technology and synthetic drugs work now, they flush out of your system much faster. So the idea that you could test for HGH in the off-season was frankly a joke, something openly mocked in the world of baseball, that there was anything like a serious drug test. The problem, though, is that now that they have in-season blood testing, what that's going to drive is much more research and technology into drugs that can beat the system. That's really the history of performance-enhancing drugs. With every advance in testing comes even more advance, because there's such a financial incentive to find more drugs, more masking agents, which are actually far more dangerous for you physically than the drugs themselves are, the masking agents themselves, and much more abuse as well of these drugs. And that's honestly the fear that I have, that unless we figure out a way to actually regiment the use of performance-enhancing drugs and figure out what's legal and what's illegal and have a doctor oversee it, all we're really looking at is honestly more research being driven towards beating the test.
Rob, do you agree with that? I mean, how bad was the problem, and how likely is it it's going to change?
Well, I think that in my mind, at least half, probably significantly more, at least dabbled in illegal steroids and other things in the 90s. I will say this, while it's true that the users, the dedicated users, will always be ahead of the testers, it's not clear how far ahead. And I really think that while you can beat the test, you can beat the test 7 years ago, you can beat the test tomorrow, if you work at it hard enough, I think the number of players who will work at it hard enough to beat the test is much, much lower than it was before. So even if you can beat the test, it doesn't mean they're going to beat the test, enough of them to make a huge dent in the statistics, for one thing. So I really do think that drug use in baseball is way down. They'll never get rid of it completely, never. But I do think it's way down.
What about other sports? I mean, we've only got a few minutes left. I wonder, you know, is this something, Rob, maybe you can answer this too. We'll start with Rob, and then we'll finish up here with Dave. You know, is this something that is unique to baseball, or is this a problem in other sports that's still being hidden? And is that sort of the next frontier that needs to be cleaned up? Is this sort of leading the way?
Well, it really comes down to the sports themselves and Congress. You know, Congress, the U.S. Congress drove a lot of the drug testing in baseball because old white men, I mean, essentially, care more about baseball and baseball statistics than they do about the other sports. That hasn't happened with the football, in football, for example. Drug use in football is rampant. We know that, and they've done very little to really address it. And the same can be said of the other sports.
Absolutely, there's drug use in every sport. Every bit of anecdotal evidence suggests that. Every discussion I've had with athletes off the record suggests that. The problem, though, as I see it, is that the gap between success and failure in the world of professional sports in this country is so profound. The amount of money a semi-pro football player, a D-League basketball player, or a minor league baseball player makes is absolute peanuts, not even Cracker Jacks, just peanuts compared to what a major league salary is. And as long as the talent differential between the tops of the minors and the major leagues is as narrow as it is, and as long as the gap between your paycheck is as vast as it is, there is going to be a culture of cheating because it's so deeply incentivized on a basic financial level.
All right, we'll leave it there. Appreciate you joining us. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And that's all for now. Thanks for watching.